All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. Welcome. I'm so glad to be with each of you and discuss this topic that is of such critical importance. My name is Emily Cook. I'm the Vice President of Education Services with Bluum. If you're not familiar with Bluum, just a quick once-over, we are an education-focused technology solution provider. That means that we create these holistic technology solutions that include everything that impacts teaching and learning from a technology perspective. So classroom displays, teacher and student devices, tools for emerging technologies, and then also tools for safety and security, along with all the services that wrap around those items to improve their impact on students. And so that sort of gives you a little bit of context for why we're talking about the topic of measurable impacts of educational technology. At Bluum, it's our mission to improve learning and make it more accessible. In the past couple of years, there has been, as you all know, just such a huge influx of technology into schools that we identified this real need to understand when and how educational technology improves learning and makes it more accessible. First, we wanted to do that just to hold ourselves accountable to our mission so that it wasn't just words on the website, but actually something that we could prove out and say, when an educational organization works with Bluum, what are the impacts that they can expect to have from that partnership? And then we started to realize along the way that this is something that so many of our educational partners were facing as well. Now more than ever, with budgets shifting, how can we ensure that what we invest in is having the maximum positive impact on students and learning? And if you're here, you know well that this is not a simple question. How educational technology improves learning can be looked at through a number of different lenses. There are so many complex factors that sometimes it feels like it's easier to just sort of turn away and focus on something a little bit more tangible. But my one encouragement to you today is that we really try hard not to avoid this question, but rather that we try to take some small steps to begin to really understand how to measure the impact of our educational technology. So I would definitely love to hear from you all as we go. Love to see an active chat. It looks like most of you have the settings set to that your chat comments go to the host and panelists. Feel free to change that to everyone if you're willing to share your input. I think everyone would love to learn from each other on this call. So feel free to use the chat functionality for that. We'll also put in links and resources in the chat as I'm talking today. If I refer to something that's not in the slides, we'll have links for you there. And then if there's specific questions that come up while we're going, feel free to put that in the Q&A section, and that way we can make sure that we get those all answered as well. So I'll pause throughout to take some questions, and then at the end, we'll also have time for some questions as well. The other thing that will happen at the end of our time today is that I'll provide you with information about a practical tip sheet that you will be sent that has really practical steps to apply the principles that we discussed today so that you can take that and apply it to your own district's initiatives. So excited for the conversation today. Thank you again for being here. I know that your time is precious, and so I don't take it lightly that you're spending a little bit of time with us today. So thanks. So quick overview of what we'll kind of run through today. Oh, thank you, Andy. Sarah is going to work on that in the background to make sure that we can share all together. Thanks. Before we go much further, here's a quick overview of what we'll cover today. We're going to talk about the current landscape, including the promises of EdTech, along with those challenges that come with educational technology. We're going to talk about how we decided on what key variables we could measure. And then we're going to talk about how that information led us to a research-based framework that I'll share a piece of that framework with you today. Then we'll talk finally about what's next. What does this work mean for you, and how can you use it as you think about your district's initiatives? All right, so let's jump in. So the educational technology landscape has changed significantly over the last 4 years. You all know that. In my work with districts, I often will review their technology plans before we sit down for an initial meeting. And I can't tell you how often we see that the current plans are from 2019, and the plan is to get to one-to-one over the next 5 years. And little did we know when that plan was written that that transition would virtually happen overnight. From 2019 till now, the number of students with one-to-one devices has doubled. Additionally, the number of digital tools that educators and students have access to has more than doubled. So that rapid change and that ubiquitous access to technology has had some really great impacts on student learning, but obviously have brought on some challenges too. And most of us in education understand that technology on its own, delivered to a school, doesn't necessarily improve teaching and learning, but it can, right? And that's what is so exciting to think about. That data that I just shared is from the Department of Education's National EdTech Plan. And one of the key takeaways that I got from reviewing that plan is that technology can be a powerful tool to transform learning. If you haven't had a chance to look at the Department of Education's National EdTech Plan, definitely would be great for you to check that out. Sarah's going to put a link to that in the chat. Don't read it now. It's over 100 pages long, but definitely worth your time. Really, the crux of that plan is the idea that technology can be a powerful tool to transform learning, but the report goes on to share the divides that exist that get in the way of technology transforming learning. So there's the digital divide, the design divide, the digital use divide, the digital design divide, and the digital access divide. So today we're going to talk about what the research tells us about how to overcome those divides and how we can measure the impacts of those efforts. Hopefully, you've also had a chance to review the report that we and Bluum have recently shared. That will come in the chat next. And that's where I pulled this 97% figure from. The Teachers in Bluum report is significantly shorter than the National EdTech Plan. So if you're looking for some lighter reading, that'll be perfect for you. And we looked at feedback that we got directly from teachers over fall of last year. We surveyed 1,400 teachers who had recently finished a professional development session that was focused on implementing new technology. And one of the findings that was particularly stark to me was included on this slide, that 97% of participants agree that student engagement level will be higher when they use the technology that they were trained on. That's incredibly exciting that just a short training could have this broad of a positive impact on both teacher efficacy and on student engagement. This feedback starts to paint a picture that technology with supportive integration not just can improve learning, but actually will. So what we're thinking about at Bluum is understanding under what circumstances will technology improve learning. Last year, we added a full-time educational researcher who specifically focused on this challenge. Her name is Dr. Katie Larson, and I'll be referring to some of her work as we talk together today. As we set the stage to talk about measuring the impacts of EdTech on learning, I want to spend a couple of minutes just to hear from you all and share with you what we think about as the promise of EdTech. What do we love about these tools and their impacts on education? And then we'll discuss some of the challenges that we know arise when integrating new technology. Understanding this balance is going to set the stage for preparing us to think about how do we make those tough decisions when it comes to planning for new tools, and how do we address the challenges that are present when launching new initiatives. Okay. So while I talk about the promise of EdTech, I listed 3 ideas that I'm going to start with here today, and I'll share a little bit about these from my own experience as an educator myself, and also from experience that I've had working with districts. But I would love it if you would want to put in the chat if there's any additional kind of promises of EdTech or benefits of EdTech that you feel like are really present in your districts, anything that I missed, or if there's one of the 3 on this slide that really stick out to you. We'll see if everyone will be able to see it, or maybe just I will, and I'll share if you don't mind.
It should be everybody. Hopefully everybody's able to switch now. I think I may have fixed it.
Thanks, Sarah.
Sure.
All right. I love it, Mike. You're speaking my language. Oh, you guys are making me so excited. That's right. So many exciting elements to integrating EdTech into classrooms. So for me, in my life before Bluum, I had the opportunity to support my school in managing the development of intervention and enrichment opportunities for students. So this first one, the career and technical educational experiences, really sticks out to me as one of those key benefits. It was so exciting to see the level of engagement and confidence when students had the opportunity to participate in the STEM lab that we developed. I think back to students who were struggling to stay engaged in their core content areas, but then when it came to these practical hands-on 21st century learning, they were so engaged, they were building confidence and self-efficacy that's required for success after graduation. These kids were running to their after-school clubs, running to their STEM classes, and so it was so exciting to see that difference. Kids that otherwise weren't feeling very successful, starting to feel more successful in school because of these opportunities. And enrichment classes, as you guys know, aren't just for students that are struggling in their core content areas. They're really beneficial to students who are doing well in school as well, right? Giving those top performers new ways to challenge themselves, new ways to get comfortable with a struggle, to iterate, to test out new ideas. So that was one of the kind of key promises of EdTech that I think is really exciting. The next one, we've all seen ways that EdTech can improve collaboration. It's improving it for us right now. How lucky are we that we get to sit down and talk together with people from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and Kansas. So it's allowing us to collaborate. And the same thing happens for our students, right? Whether they're using a shared document to edit each other's writing projects, or they're using blog posts to write about their favorite book and then engage with peers in the comments section, or how students can connect with other students from across the country and even across the world to learn together and to learn about one another without the boundaries of location or language getting in the way. And finally, I probably get the most excited about accessibility. And this kind of speaks to what somebody wrote in the chat about personalized instruction. So I know when we talk about access, oftentimes we're thinking about just putting the technology in the hands of every student in a way that's equitable. But when I think about access, I'm thinking about meeting individual learning needs of students and overcoming the limitations of time and space. So technology can break down so many boundaries. When students have access to devices and Wi-Fi, they can learn from anywhere. I am personally a mom of 3 and my oldest is 9. So if you do your fast math, you'll realize that that means that my son started kindergarten during the pandemic. So he went to kindergarten for the first time when school was only remote. And it was this access to his teacher and this access to the content that made it so that now in 3rd grade, he is right on track and is not, exhibiting the fact that he missed a whole kindergarten year. So the access to the tools provided access to the content and access to the teacher. But it's about so much more than that, right? It's also today providing access to content that's really rich and exciting and giving students the ability to have experiences that they wouldn't otherwise have without technology. So when we're learning about neurons in a brain, what does it look like to be inside of a brain using virtual reality and seeing those neurons fire? How much richer is that learning experience going to be? So really, really important that we look at kind of all those elements of access. If there are any others, I'll give just a second. If you want to add any to the chat, or if there's any that I mentioned that stick out to you specifically. And then along with those promises of EdTech, I didn't want to move too fast to the challenges, but we will, because we all know there are some really serious challenges. So we're going to take a minute to talk about these as well, and we can see how we line up on those. If you're thinking about some of the challenges that your district has faced as a result of this influx of technology, feel free to add those to the chat as well, or if there's any that I picked out that you particularly agree with, feel free to call those out as well. So the first one that we hear about a lot is the challenge of insufficient network and security. On average, most districts refreshed their network most recently in 2006. So you can imagine that that means that we're bringing all of this brand new technology and attempting to do these really innovative activities on a network that's really unable to support it. When we're in the field gathering data for research, the number one challenge that we hear from teachers is the challenge around the network. In our one of our recent research studies, 52% of teachers reported that technology infrastructure was impeding their ability to fully integrate EdTech into their classroom ecosystem. And for those of you who have been teachers yourself, you know that feeling. I taught kindergarten before my second to last most recent role. And if you try one time to connect your device to your panel and something doesn't work, it doesn't matter why. It just matters that you now have 24 little pairs of eyeballs on you and you're scrambling to try to get it to work. And that can be really discouraging and challenging for teachers. And that really closely relates to the challenge of overburdened educators. Before I move on, though, I do want to just take a moment to talk about the security piece. Cybersecurity is a huge area of concern and a focus for a lot of technology leaders, especially, but it really needs to be an area of concern for every stakeholder within the district. Cybersecurity threats are real. K12 districts are one of the most at-risk types of organizations, and it's easy to understand why, right? We have precious data and so many possible entry points for some of those bad actors. And so really critical that we're kind of thinking about the challenges of network and security. As I alluded to, the other common challenge that I probably hear the most about anecdotally is the challenge of teachers feeling overburdened. And the research reports this as well. So often when new ed tech is deployed, the considerations for how to provide ongoing support for teachers is really overlooked. So these new innovative devices that have so much promise end up feeling like one more thing for a teacher, rather than like one thing that can make everything else easier and better and more engaging. So for us, our professional development department supports these teachers directly, and they are very clear that they need more training to help them get started, and then they need really more ongoing support to make sure that the investments are being maximized to transform learning. And then finally, we can't talk about common challenges without mentioning budgets. There is a lot of variability. I'm sure every single person that's with us today would say, would have a different experience with what budgets are looking like as we look ahead. State to state, there's variability. School to school, there's variability. But this is a driving force for people wanting to dig in to the research about how the ed tech is being used so that we can really create priorities for how to move forward. So with all of this in mind, the great promise of ed tech and the very real challenges, it's obviously really complex to figure out how to move forward. It's my belief that the data on how technology is impacting learning will help clear away some of the noise and help us move forward in a way that's most impactful. I think sometimes in education, we over-rely on anecdotal information because it's what we see, it's the stories that we share, and it is incredibly important. But when we come up against scarce resources like time and money, we need some really objective insights to help inform our decision-making. And I'm not alone in saying this. District leaders are echoing the sentiment. I suppose that's why we're all here today, right? We need better information, not just usage data that this tool was used for this many minutes. That is a critical piece for sure, but we need to have more information about how that usage actually transforms learning experiences and outcomes for students. But it's tricky. For Bluum, we're facing the same challenge as many of you. As I said earlier on, our mission is to improve learning and make it more accessible. It probably sounds similar to a lot of the missions for the organizations that you are a part of. And it's tricky because it's not very straightforward. We're talking about this holistic learning environment. You know, when you're talking about investing in a new software, the measurement's pretty straightforward. If it's a security software, we can easily measure how many at-risk activities were caught. If it's a reading software, we can look at usage data and then the student data as it relates to reading scores and uncover if there's correlations there, and that gives us straightforward information. But when we talk about these holistic solutions, like the ones that Bluum helps to curate, where you could see in this picture, there's student devices, teacher devices, displays, furniture, emerging technologies. And then our solutions include more than what's pictured. We have planning support, production services, ongoing support, and PD services. How can you kind of look at that holistic solution and evaluate how those items are all working together to improve learning and what's needed to increase that positive impact on learning? There are so many variables that can impact whether the tech can improve learning. For starters, like I mentioned, there's the functioning of the technology itself. Does it do what we want it to do? And then do teachers have enough training to use it in all of the ways that it could potentially be used? Then do they have IT and technical support to help when they need it? And then there's, of course, individual student variables, their individual background, socioeconomic status, their comfort using the technology, their language needs. So with all of this in mind, we realized we needed a framework, a way to gather and synthesize information so we could use it to make better decisions and drive better instructional practices. So I'm going to take you through the journey of how we looked at this research question and developed a tool that can be used to measure that holistic learning improvement. Right, here we go. So the first thing that we did, just to give you a little peek behind the scenes, was we turned to the scientific literature base. We worked to understand theories of learning. As I mentioned, we hired a full-time educational researcher because we realized this is a full-time job. It's a lot of work. We needed someone with a strong background in education and a strong background in research to begin this work. And it's been many months of reading, learning, collecting resources. And so what we did was we started with some strong overarching theories of learning impacts. One of our first conversations we had was with John Hattie. You might be familiar with the work that he did on visible learning. He did a really incredible meta-analysis of a ton of research to look at what are different variables that have the largest impact on visible learning. We also considered theories like self-determination theory, so understanding what's responsible for increasing students' motivation, what are the indicators that underlie growth and development in students, and then came the real mind melt. We dug into hundreds of articles that looked at specific types of educational technology and their impacts on learning. We'll link to the chat our research hub that you're welcome to access. That's where we've put a lot of the studies that really helped drive this work forward. So if you want to dig into those and look, if there's specific initiatives that you're planning, like a one-to-one refresh, or you're thinking about displays in a classroom, you can look at some of the research there that will be really insightful, I think, as you're making those decisions. With all of that in mind, we started to understand that there are common conditions under which EdTech will have the most impact on learning outcomes. So now imagine there's dozens of domains that we could look at to understand the connection between EdTech and achievement. But what we know is that in any good research, you have to create a hypothesis. We had to create a working theory of what we thought we could influence. So it becomes really important to isolate what is within your sphere of influence. I'm going to challenge you to consider this, because your sphere of influence is going to be different than ours is at Bluum, right? I saw all different types of educational roles signed up for this webinar. So you might be the chief academic officer, you might be the chief technology officer, you might be a tech coach. Your sphere of influence is going to be different, right? But thinking about what are you hoping that this new technology initiative will impact, or one that you recently invested in, what were you hoping that the impacts would be? It's important that we really identify and name what are we hoping the impacts will be, so that we can isolate those and start to measure when we're accomplishing those goals. And then the last part here is we had to consider what data do we need to measure whether those domains are being impacted. So now that we've narrowed down to kind of some domains, then we had to think about what were the data sources that we could use to measure how we were accomplishing those goals. We needed to have multiple sources. So you might, for us, it looks like maybe gathering objective information from a technology assessment for the district, understanding what was deployed, when it was deployed, what do we know about the usage rates. We also needed feedback from stakeholders. So surveys from teachers, gathering their perspectives, surveys from students, uncovering their experiences of technology use and their experiences more generally in the classroom. We also created some structured observation protocols, so gathering data from what we could witness firsthand in classrooms. And then also digging into small groups or one-on-ones and having focus groups with teachers or students to dig a little bit deeper. So at the end of all of that, we determined 3 domains that research supports. If we increase the presence of those domains, then learning will be improved for students. So this is what they were for us. If we improve teacher efficacy, student engagement, and accessibility, then we know, based on the research that we've looked at, that we are improving learning for students. So I'm going to take a minute just to kind of share with you a little bit about each of these. First one is teacher efficacy. So teacher efficacy describes a teacher's confidence in their ability to positively impact student learning. Domain 2 is about student engagement. That refers to the degree of attention, curiosity, interest, optimism, passion, all those good things we want students to be showing when they're learning. And that all extends to the level of motivation that they have to learn and progress in their education. And then lastly, accessibility. And as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about access, we're not just talking about the structural components of technology. So is the technology in place? Does it function? Is it reliable? Those things are really important, but equally important is looking at the content access. Are the technology tools providing authentic, engaging, motivating experiences? And then the final piece to access is looking at the individualized access. So is the technology providing ways to break down barriers that might come from special learning needs or language barriers and so on? Okay, so I'm going to take a moment now to show you just a sample piece of the framework that we created based on the research. The research really pointed us in the right direction to uncover specific indicators that the domains are present. So this is just a small sample section of the framework that we're using to evaluate the improvement of EdTech in classrooms. If you look under teacher efficacy, I just picked out 3 of the indicators here. There's probably a half dozen more that we use just to give you kind of a sample. Each of the sections contain those research-based indicators for improved learning. There's strong research that supports that when those indicators are present, that learning has improved. This alone, if you handed this and the other indicators to a teacher, if you handed it to me when I was a teacher, I probably could have given you like a gut instinct of how we were doing and where I could improve, which is great. But the reason that we're here is that we want to do more than the gut instinct, right? We want to objectively measure each domain. So I'm going to take a moment to talk about how we can do this. For example, in the domain of teacher efficacy, how do we know if these indicators and the others that are not on this slide are present? One tool that we use most frequently is teacher surveys. The key with surveys, in my opinion, is to use them more than once. So they're super easy, inexpensive ways to have a snapshot of what's going on and the impact of the investment. But it's really critical that we do them before the deployment of new technology, immediately after, possibly again after a training, and then maybe again 6 months later, so that you can see over time how that deployment has impacted teacher efficacy. Through that feedback that we get from a survey, we can really get a picture of what those continuous improvement opportunities are. So if we find out that maybe teachers had adequate training and they feel comfortable with the classroom logistics, great. But maybe they don't understand yet how to use that technology to differentiate learning. Then that's a great thing to target future PD sessions on or future communications. Maybe a tip sheet goes out to teachers across the district to help them really connect the dots. Focus groups are another great way to get information from teachers. This is where we can dig in a little bit deeper to their feedback and their experiences. And they're generally focused on smaller groups of teachers where you can go a little bit deeper in those conversations. The other part here that I mentioned is the observation protocol. That obviously takes a little bit more legwork and time, but that means sitting down in a classroom and actually marking down what you see, what technology is present, how it's being used, what does student engagement look like. So if you're interested in looking at the level of efficacy that teachers are experiencing in your district or in your school, you could use any one of those data sources, or you could use all 3. Obviously, the more that you do, the more complete picture that you're going to have of what's happening in the district or in the school. For the domain of student engagement, teacher surveys are still really helpful here. Student self-rating, so kind of a student survey, is also really helpful here. I would caution you that it's probably more helpful in 3rd grade and up for students. They're great at responding to surveys and are pretty reliable. Anything less than 3rd grade, I would say handle with care. I attempted to do a survey with 1st graders a week or so ago, and their feedback would have made great content and a funny little video for this conversation today, but was not particularly reliable data. So, using that in conjunction with a teacher survey and with a classroom observation is helpful, but probably not going to paint the full picture for the 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds. And then, as I said, the observation protocol is really helpful here as well. In a single classroom observation, we can gather so much just in a couple of minutes about what the tool means for engagement of students. So there's a lot that can be done there. And then finally, the area of accessibility. I hated leaving off some of the indicators on this one because there's so much to talk about when it comes to accessibility. But just a reminder that we're talking about the structural access, content access, and individualized access. And really understanding, are the tools being used to engage students to overcome, their specific learning needs? So the indicators on domain 3 are going to be looking at all of the parts. Does infrastructure work to support learning goals? Is the technology making the learning more engaging and authentic? And is it being used to meet individual needs? To measure this domain, still teacher surveys and observation protocols make a lot of sense. But this is where an EdTech leadership assessment or survey can really come into play. Technology assessments are so important in just gathering a snapshot of what's in place within the district, what's working, how do we respond when things aren't working, and really understanding the whole picture. So I want to just give you a snapshot of what this can look like when we're using it for an individual school or district. So first, what we have here is kind of an overview of a baseline feedback that we information that we get. So we take all of those surveys and the structured observations, teacher feedback, student feedback, and we're kind of putting it together to give ourselves an idea of where a school or a district lands on each domain within the technology framework, right? And then what we did in this case is we did all of that data collection again midway through the year. So about 5 months into the deployment of technology. In this particular example, we had an embedded educational technology coach. So that was a Bluum PD specialist that was specifically assigned to this school to support teachers. And so what we were able to see was holistic growth in each area. So overall, looking at the scores on all of the indicators and then kind of laying them next to where they were in the beginning of the year showed really pretty significant improvement in each of the domains. And then from there, what we can do, one great way that we can use this at a school level or at a district level would be to dig into what are the bright spots and the areas for focus based on the information that we've gotten. So the bright spots are the areas, one per domain, where the technology is being used in a way that's really exemplary or accomplishing the goal. So in this case, you can see under teacher efficacy that the teacher's demonstrating a variety of strategies to incorporate their technology. Domains 2 and 3, you can see students are consistently collaborating, and UDL principles are evident in that students have multiple ways that they're able to represent what they're learning. And then the areas of focus are the indicators within the domain where there's still room for growth, right? If we want to see these scores continue to increase, these would be the areas that we would target. So a couple of things I just want to point out before we go much further is, number one, these frameworks are not meant to be evaluative. This is not how we measure a teacher and how they're doing in their classroom. What this is telling us is, how do we continue to drive ongoing improvement? The ability to really target exactly what indicators are already accomplished or exemplary helps us spend our most precious resource, which is time, in a way that's most effective, so that we can support teachers and transform learning in a way that's going to really improve experiences for each kid and outcomes for each kid. The second thing I just want to mention while we're still on this slide is about utilizing this framework to look at a classroom or a school district's needs. We've talked about that, but I think it's also important that we look at using a framework like this to look at smaller subgroups of students to make sure that the transformation in learning is equitable across student groups. So you may want to look at what this looks like if you're responsible for a district. Is every individual school, regardless of their specific needs or socioeconomic status or presence of language barriers, are they all seeing the same level of improvement, right? And so same for subgroups of students. Are there differences in the experience of students who have specific learning needs or who have specific language needs? We want to make sure that we are looking at each of those subgroups as much as possible with a framework like this. All right. If there are any questions, feel free to put those in the question and answer section. And I will make sure that I cover those. All right. So we started the conversation today by acknowledging that this question of whether or not EdTech improves learning for students is pretty complex. And I encouraged you not to let the complexity get in the way of starting to do some measurement in continuous improvement. And I just also want to encourage you that it doesn't have to be using our specific surveys or our specific observation tools. You could certainly create your own. Of course, we'd love to partner with you. But whatever you do, I just want to kind of bring you back to this little pyramid here, that whatever we do, we want to start with current research. There has already been so much legwork done by really, really smart people looking at the connection between educational technology and impacts on learning. And so we want to use that to drive what we measure and the goals that we set. And then we need to determine what we're hoping to impact. What's within your sphere of influence that you think is going to be impacted by a new technology initiative? So we have folks coming to us all the time to help with planning around a new esports lab. So what are we hoping is going to change here? Is it increasing attendance? Is it decreasing discipline issues? Is it increasing engagement? Or another project that we work on a lot is planning for a new STEM lab. So what are we hoping are the impacts of that, right? So just remembering that technology on its own is not going to move the needle. We have to really target the outcomes that we're hoping to influence. And then finally, make a plan for that data collection. Surveys are simple. They give us tons of information. Focus groups can be incredibly powerful. But whatever we do, we can't avoid this question because it's complex. So just would love to encourage you to spend a couple of minutes to think about recent initiatives that you've worked on or those that you're planning for the next 3 to 5 years, and think about where does the research play in, what are the goals, and what's within your sphere of influence, and then how are we going to measure against that? Because it's complex, I wanted to leave you with a practical tool today. You will get this tip sheet by email as a thank you for coming. So I hope that this helps you as kind of a tool to put in your own notes and kind of do some of that work that we've talked about today. The last question on the tip sheet that we're sending out is about thought partnership. And I just think it's really important that you think about who you can lean on as you think through some of these challenges, because I think so often in education, we work in silos. Everybody is working so hard with their head down to handle the task in front of them. But I included that question just to remind you that you are not alone in this work. There are a lot of us who are thinking through these questions. There are colleagues within your district. There are colleagues at nearby districts that have been doing this work as well. And so, make sure that you reach out, you lean on other people's experiences. And of course, we would love to be that thought partner with you, to work side by side with you to accomplish that goal of improving learning and making it more accessible. So to that end, I'll just spend a couple of minutes here at the end to give you some information about how we can stay connected. First, I included on this slide just a couple of the services that the Educational Service Department covers. So with Bluum, you have a dedicated account executive that can connect you with an education services team member at any point along your technology planning and implementation journey. If any of these services would be helpful to you, I'd love to connect with you and understand how we can best support the work that you're doing. Just a quick high-level advisory services. That is really best at the beginning when you're starting out a new initiative. This is where we integrate your strategic goals and vision, feedback from stakeholders, and then create a holistic plan for effective implementation. Usually these plans will include some kind of professional development and research because we think that's really important in order to improve learning. But if you're past the planning stage and you're ready for deployment and adoption, that's where the research and the professional development teams can come in. We have just the most incredible team of professional development experts who work side by side with teachers to see some of those indicators that we talked about come into practice even more. And then finally, of course, we're happy to work with you to be your external researcher to create, what that research question is. We want to help you measure it. And, if you need help on developing surveys, developing structured observations that are unique to your work, that's something that we're happy to partner with you on. All right, so please take note of my contact information. If there are any of those services that would be helpful, I'm happy to follow up with you directly. If you already should have a relationship with your local Bluum account executive, so they're eager to help you with that as well. And then anything else that we can do to help to answer questions or follow up about any of this information, happy to. I have a little QR code here. I would really appreciate it, my personal ask, if you would take just an extra minute to fill out a quick survey feedback form. That's where the QR code will take you. Sarah also just put it in the chat. I'd love to know what your key takeaways are, and if there are any outstanding questions that I can answer, I'd love to do that. So if there are any questions that you want to talk about live here today, you can put those in the Q&A section. The links for everything we talked about is in the chat. I want to thank you again so much for your time today. I know that time is the most precious resource, so really appreciate you being here. Have a wonderful day.